All right, welcome to Two Sons Podcast. Every Friday, everybody. Long time no see. We are getting the engine back up and running for Andor Season 2 and for The Last of Us Season 2, which I'm super excited for. But today we're going to be doing something a little different. We have been for a long time talking about what we're going to do on the book front, specifically going through this like trio, this kind of famous Legends trio of books, which is the Labyrinth of Evil, which flows directly into the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which flows directly into Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader. And it's been a little bit of a slow start because the one that we're both looking forward to most is Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, because it's Luceno and it's like Anakin and Palpatine's initial Sith relationship and like what that looks like. We're super excited for that book, but we got to earn the right to get there. And so there was no audiobook for Labyrinth of Evil, so it took us a very long time.
I think it literally took us 8 months.
Yeah, dude. But when we went skiing in Tamarack, I literally was like, I'm reading this on every single flight. I am forcing myself.
You doing that made me get like really into it because normally when I have some downtime at work, I just do some continuing education stuff. Yeah. But I was just locked into my Star Wars book. It's like, no, let the patient wait. I'm reading. No, I'd never do that. I would never do that.
I know. You're just kidding.
Impossible am I in room 3. Let me just finish out this chapter really quick.
But anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about Labyrinth of Evil. We're just going to go for about 30 minutes today. Nothing crazy. And then I started the audiobook because there is a full unabridged audiobook for the Revenge of the Sith novelization, read by Jonathan Davis, who's the same guy who read the Bane books, for those of you guys who went through those. And so it's some deja vu there. But,
huge deja vu.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That put me back into it.
Yeah, like different voices that work, or like that make a lot of sense. Yeah, like I love it. He's using the voice he used for Kasim for he's using that for Palpatine, but it kind of like works because it's kind of like snaky sounding.
It is snaky.
Yeah.
The only thing where it's not really hitting home is General Grievous.
That's a tough one, though.
Dude, it is hard. Like, that's a lot of augmentation, I guess you could say, for what Grievous sounded like in all of the shows and the movies. Like, that's a hard one to get. Like, you kind of just have to give him a pass on that.
Oh, no.
For sure.
The audiobook setup is, like, do you remember in the first Thrawn book, when they go to the like planet where like the alien species has like sacred land, and then the dudes want to go dig up this priest spice.
Yes,
they add the scratchy sound behind it. It's like,
Mark Thompson was reading that the first time, and he was reading the description of the alien voices, and he was probably like, shit, this is gonna sound like shit.
Well, because the description of the voice was literally like, at the same time, super harsh and grating, but very melodious. And it's like those two things are very
and it was like
cross purposes.
Yeah, they called it screeching, and they literally made screeching noises with every syllable. It was rough.
That one's brutal.
I'd be listening to that, and Elena would overhear it, and she'd be like, "What are you listening to? Like, this is the weirdest shit I've ever heard."
Elena, this is canon.
Yeah, this is canon. Back up.
So, to me, the Labyrinth of Evil was a little bit of a slow start. A lot of like procedural action scenes as Obi-Wan and Anakin were going from planet to planet. But
agreed.
Like, the gist of the plot is very simple, honestly. There wasn't much in terms of plot in the book. The entire purpose of the book, I thought, my read on it, was essentially to show that Palpatine had this big plan for this invasion of Coruscant. And we get more of the plan in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which I cannot wait to discuss because it was so interesting. But this plan essentially was this invasion of Coruscant that Palpatine was viewing as like the final act of the war. And he had been holding it in reserve. But what happened was the Neimoidians, our Trade Federation execs, they end up in a situation where they forget the Mechno chair, which is like the chair that he walked around with the spider legs, and it has a very specific type of receiver, this like holo transceiver that like only the people that were in the inner circle of the Sith had access to it, including Darth Maul in his ship, and all these like
Techno Union,
all these people, Dooku, etc. And so essentially what happens is Anakin and Obi-Wan find this chair, and they start following this like breadcrumb trail of clues that actually literally takes them to 500 Republica, like takes them to It takes him to the Works, the building that Darth Plagueis owned out there, that Darth Sidious moved into, and Dooku did his entire Sith training in, which I thought.
Which hearing about the Works was really interesting too. Yeah. How nobody knows who owns things just because it's so old and decrepit and like infested with like chemicals and filth that like nobody wants the land.
Yeah, no one wants it.
It's crazy,
and like no one has any maps of it, so no one understands any of like the floor layout stuff. But like there. It is procedural, as I said. The only thing that I thought was interesting at that part, during the part of the investigation, that like really stuck out to me was like some of the specific conversations Palpatine was having with Jedi and with Darth Tyrannus, where it's like with the Jedi, like he's like kind of egging them on. It's like, well, how's it going? Like, and the Jedi are explaining like, here's why we must catch Sidious. Sidious is the real problem. Sidious is ultimately and at one point Palpatine's like, oh, so you're saying that this is actually more of a conflict within the Force than like with soldiers and armies, and like, you know, Yoda and Mace Windu are like, yes, that's what we're saying.
Right.
And then like he looks back and he's like, well, then we must get Darth Sidious at all costs. Like he's just like leading into it, but at the same time, to Lord Tyrannus, like he's kind of like, hey, we got to get in front of this.
Right?
Like,
they're
like, starting to get a little close.
Yeah. We're a little worried now.
And so essentially, the climax of the book is the Jedi do eventually make their way to the Works. They find all of this evidence of Sith training, basically, because they see lightsaber slashed up droids and all this like different automata in there,
right?
And but they at the bottom of the building, they end up finding like this secret pathway that goes all the way through the Works, straight to the basement of 500 Republica, which is where Palpatine's been living this whole time.
And everybody else who's wealthy and rich in Coruscant. No, that was such a cool part of the story where they just got close. They just felt themselves getting closer and closer and closer to 500 Republica.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was such a cool read. You know, like that part of the book, what was the ARC trooper's name? I think it was Dine.
Oh, yeah, the guy who ends up actually seeing Sidious.
Yes.
Yeah, that scene was so cool.
I meant to bring the book because I wanted to read a part of it, but I'll spare everybody that. But literally, it talks about his final breaths of life. And how it was like he thought he had seen his life flashing before him, but rather it was his death. And then it explains his gruesome death, like the last like probably 20 seconds of it, about how he felt like his insides like turning to mush.
Well, because Palpatine used the Force and threw him into the bulkhead. Yes. Like and literally just like pulverized him on the bulkhead.
And then he was talking about like seeing other people surrounding him, and their bodies were disfigured in like all these grotesque positions. And then how it dawned on him that he recognized the person that had done it to him, which was Palpatine, and then he died.
Yeah, and how he kind of was like, oh shit. He really is in charge of all the senators.
Right. Yeah. And then it was his view through like a red tinged lens, and he couldn't decide if it was blood that he was seeing or if it was something else. I can't remember.
Like a power or like part of the whole vibe. Yeah, dude,
it was so incredible.
That scene, I'm so glad you broke down that scene, because that was like they literally, what happened was, and this is the genius of Palpatine pulling the trigger early. Palpatine basically tells Grievous and Dooku, like, we're triggering the plan early, the plan to invade Coruscant, right? And he essentially, like, before I get into the details of the plan, like, Palpatine triggers it just in time, because Mace Windu and several other Jedi Masters were with Dine about to get to where Palpatine was in 500 Republica, and they got separated right as the Separatists started attacking, bombarding, and killing civilians and all that stuff. All the Jedi ran off to go help with other stuff, and that left the commando group as the only group that was going to continue to pursue Sidious. So it like literally saved them from that confrontation early, which was the genius of the plan. But it goes into some more specifics, and this is where I thought it got really cool. And I'm going to kind of bleed this over into the Revenge of the Sith novelization, because it kind of is connected to the same plan.
Dude, highly connected. I'm having a hard time already distinguishing the difference between the two books in my brain, because it just flowed so beautifully into the new book that we're reading, Revenge of the Sith. The
scene, which we're going to get into here in a minute, the scene with of Dooku fighting Anakin and Obi-Wan is like one of my favorite Star Wars book scenes I've ever read or listened to someone read to me.
Right.
But
I anyway, still consider it a read.
Yeah, it still counts.
It's
still
the same part of your brain.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, essentially the plan, the way it kind of manifested was, so Palpatine ends up secretly giving these like these hyper lanes that exist from the inner core, like the deep core, like kind of backdooring into Coruscant, these like fancy hyperspace lanes. And so it essentially allowed the Separatist fleet to get into like imminent attack range of Coruscant without having to get through any of their perimeter defenses. And immediately the Jedi like prick up and they're like, how could anybody have known these hyper lanes? You know,
right.
And there's that was essentially how they got into the planet. And then from there's this pretty extensive like chase scene essentially involving General Grievous and there's two Jedi Masters. It's Shakti and then one other, I can't remember.
Was it Mace? Was it Mace on the train or no?
No, Mace ended up going to Mace ended up doing something different. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it ended up being the two female Jedi Masters that were alone with Palpatine. No, that's right. Mace ended up going after Grievous. Grievous attacks him on like a train.
Yeah.
And then Mace goes after Grievous, and then they leave two Jedi Masters with Palpatine.
Correct.
And they still, essentially, like right when he gets to the deep bunker where it's like the safe space is like right where Grievous ends up catching him, and it's all part
Grievous
of this
just like walks in
plan. Yeah.
Yeah, that part was really cool. The whole entire train scene was classic, just because any good adventure movie or any good action movie like has to have either like a motorcycle in it, a plane, or a train. You know, like that's like an absolute rule, right?
Planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea of them just ripping this train to shreds as it's suspended going through Coruscant with all these civilians aboard was so dope. And it just talked about in detail Grievous's abilities that supersede other beings, just because he's so mechanical, and he's got like his magnetic feet that can like grab into metal, and how powerful he truly is. Like Grievous is a badass. Like in this book also, in the beginning, they broke down why Grievous hates the Jedi so much, and essentially we find out that
his whole origin story,
which was
break that down for us.
Yeah, so essentially we find out that General Grievous's people, the Huck, right?
Yeah, the Huck.
Were in battle with a neighboring planet system, and essentially they were just kicking ass, just doing their thing. And then the Republic shows up and then takes sides of their competitors, and then that makes Grievous like hate the Republic essentially, because he watched his people starve because of it.
And the Republic sided with their enemies because they had like more resources in their planet. You know, like they had more to profiteer from.
Yeah, so Grievous has this baseline hatred, right? And then on top of that, Grievous was in a ship that they had made crash, and that was Sidious's and Tyrannus's plan, and they had tried to almost kill him so that they could rebuild him, and they found out that he had survived more than they thought he would in this wreckage. So then they damaged him even more after they apparently went and saved him. They created Grievous, and then they essentially instilled this supernatural hatred for the Republic, and especially Jedi, when they were rebuilding him, and they essentially brainwashed him into thinking that the Republic was worse than it actually was. So then it became his life goal to destroy Jedi, and rightfully so. I mean, that's a pretty awful story, right? But yeah, super interesting Grievous's backstory, and it made me like him even more than I ever thought I could. He's so interesting.
He's much more interesting as a character when you understand like his backstory in terms of his own emotional like kind of motivations, but also just the way he fits into the grand plan.
Right.
And like and to take it kind of extended forward. So essentially what happens is Palpatine gets captured and brought up to the capital ship. But then instead of taking Palpatine out of the system, they just sit there with Dooku on the ship. So it's Dooku and Grievous, obviously, as you guys know from the start of the Revenge of the Sith movie, that they're all sitting on the invisible hand and waiting for Obi-Wan and Anakin to show up and rescue. And there's actually, in the Revenge of the Sith novelization at the start, there is this kind of conversation that Grievous has with Dooku, where he keeps telling him, like, I must recommend, sir, that we get the Chancellor out of here before they go get, like, because of course Grievous doesn't, like, Grievous you can tell is like in the Sith inner circle, but not really, in the sense that like he views the Sith strictly as the head of the of the Confederacy and not as he doesn't understand that Palpatine is actually.
Isn't that wild? I never really understood that. For some reason, I had never thought about that relationship with Grievous and Palpatine, and it's always something that I've wondered about. And then in Labyrinth of Evil, it makes it clear that Grievous has no clue that Palpatine is actually Sidious.
Yep.
And I thought that was wildly interesting as well, because Grievous really never finds out. Well, I mean, eventually, but he literally has no clue that he's with a Sith Lord, to the point where at the end of the book, Grievous is telling Palpatine that he's going to have to talk on the HoloNet. And then I'm pretty sure Palpatine pulls a slight Jedi mind trick on him during that scene. I can't remember the specifics.
I think I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the specifics either.
Yeah, Grievous tells him he's going to do something, and Palpatine's like, okay, but I'm not going to do it this way. And Grievous is like, okay.
Oh, yeah.
And he's fine with it.
And there's also there's these hilarious moments where it's like Grievous thought it was strange because the Chancellor kind of broke character a couple times and was like, if you're not careful, you're going to kill both of us, or something like that.
And you can just imagine Palpatine in his disgusting, conniving, nasty voice, saying shit to Grievous. I think that'd be hilarious. And Grievous actually had some respect for him because of it.
This damn puppet that I created is going to get me killed in just a regular ship crash. But so this I thought the most interesting part of the plan. So you kind of can imagine a situation where. And there's a conversation to be had about whether or not Dooku should have seen this coming a lot earlier. But we can have
I know exactly where you're going.
Is Dooku an idiot? Is another debate that we can have. But
he's too pompous to have realized.
They break down essentially what Palpatine convinced Dooku the plan was that they were going to play the bait game by having Palpatine and Dooku sit in this room. And that Anakin and Obi-Wan would show up, and that in the ensuing confrontation, Dooku would kill Obi-Wan, and then fake losing to Anakin in a submissive kind of way, and then he would be captured. And essentially, then they reveal that the entire purpose of the character Grievous was to take the fall for all of the negative shit that happened in the war, so that they could rehab Dooku's image as a prisoner and then basically bring the conflict to resolution. And then essentially, because Obi-Wan died, Anakin lost his father figure / brother figure. Anakin will turn to the dark side. There will be 3 Sith. They even hint at in the book this idea that Dooku was going to essentially, with Palpatine's help, train Anakin to lead a Sith army of Force users, all this stuff. So Dooku is just clearly drinking the Kool-Aid.
For sure, he was so into himself. They made it clear how just kind of big of a prick Dooku is.
Oh yeah,
and just how pompous he is. And they really get into that during the Revenge of the Sith novel, where he's in the battle, which we'll get to, between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and how he's just thinking to himself about how much better he is than them, and he's just he's disgusted that Anakin would stoop as low to have a fake hand instead of just have a nub. He thought that would be the most I'm trying
he said a real gentleman would have just learned to fight with one hand. I thought that was so funny.
He's just such an a-hole. So and then he's talking with Palpatine, and Palpatine's like, oh, by the way, if Anakin really starts to actually best you, I'll step in and save your life.
Yeah,
which is ridiculous.
Yeah,
which is absolutely ridiculous.
And so this sets the stage for what was you had talked to me about how the writing style was a little weird, and it's a little weird. There's a couple of different inconsistencies too. The author early in the book tries to paint the picture that the Republic was losing the war, when the Labyrinth of Evil kind of goes out of its way to say that the Republic's winning the war, and that they push the Separatists out to the outer rim and they're besieging them, and Coruscant is safe. That's kind of the craziness of the invasion, So there's some inconsistencies there. You mentioned an example to me privately. You were like, it kind of annoys me that he keeps saying invisible hand instead of the invisible hand.
Dude, it drives me crazy.
All this kind of stuff. There's little things like that are inconsistencies, but this scene I thought was extremely well written. And essentially the way it breaks down is Dooku begins this fight with Anakin and Obi-Wan, and both Anakin and Obi-Wan basically for the first few passes of the fight fake using different styles.
Yes.
And Dooku's in this kind of playful mode where he's just toying with them, And he kind of starts waxing eloquent about how like, yeah, like these two were clearly have a ton of experience like fighting as a team against multiple opponents, but they clearly don't have a ton of experience fighting as a team against one single opponent. And then all of a sudden something shifts, and it turns out Anakin and Obi-Wan were both basically feigning different styles, and they both switched to these different kinds of styles. And then there's this incredible scene that, and I'm not even going to try to like really get into detail. It just, the author basically tries to create chaos through his writing style, essentially showing that Dooku all of a sudden is like fighting for his life.
Right.
And basically like Dooku's like fending off one of them, but then he finally gets some separation from one of them, and then the other one's just right on top of him, and they do such a good job of explaining like how Anakin and Obi-Wan are all of a sudden like overwhelming, and he legitimately feels fear. They talk about him feeling fear, and then what ends up happening is he's like, I have to cheat. So he like triggers the two super battle droids. The two super battle droids start shooting. It creates enough of a distraction for him to deliver the near death blow to Obi-Wan. And then one of the coolest scenes when they're explaining Anakin raining down on Dooku, he breaks down like the fury and the stuff that's starting to kind of show through with the fury, but that Anakin like keeps like showing the fury but then pulling back, and then showing the fury and then pulling back. And when he's showing the fury, Dooku's like kind of like, this is incredible. This kid is so incredibly like powerful and talented and all this kind of stuff. And he talks about his physical prowess and how he's just super big and strong, and how he's 83 years old, and this is just not as easy as it used to be.
Right.
And then what happens is there's a moment where Dooku gets a little freaked out because Palpatine looks over at Anakin and goes like use your rage, use your fury, like trust in this part of yourself.
And he specifically says he uses Sidious's voice, not Palpatine's voice.
Yep. He uses the Sidious's voice. And he also says that they make this comment about how Anakin just kind of like needed permission, essentially, to do the thing that he was going to do. And so what ends up happening is Anakin just leans into it and goes crazy. And the way the writer did put it down was so perfect. It was like, it didn't matter how much experience Dooku had. It didn't matter how gifted of a swordsman he was. It didn't matter how many styles and forms he knew, or how many advantages he had over Anakin. It was just like Anakin was channeling the dark side of the Force like in such an overwhelming way that the outcome was essentially inevitable. It was written in a way that was so like you could kind of like just imagine being in Dooku's shoes and being like, oh shit, there's nothing I can do.
I made a huge mistake here. Right. And then he starts to doubt himself and his relationship with Palpatine. And then what's really cool is after that occurs, we get to have Dooku's point of view, if I remember right, up until the very final blow. And then it goes into Anakin's view. And it talks about his sensation of being like torn within the Force almost, and going back and forth between like restraint and then just giving into it. And then you did talk about how like Palpatine essentially just gives him the permission to just kind of like just to let loose. And then he talks about how as Anakin he feels like he has almost like two personalities in a way. Like it makes him think back to when he had slaughtered the Sand People and how it just felt like a different being had done that, and now he's back to Anakin, the good Anakin, right? And then he explained him leading up into the moments of killing Dooku, and it was almost inevitable that it was going to happen, is how Anakin felt, like as if it was like a dream that he had already witnessed, that he was just like,
because he did
portraying
the scene where before they get on the lifts, like Anakin like grabs Obi-Wan and is like, Master, I just like saw a vision, like we're gonna end the war today. Like, he saw in his vision the two lightsabers crossed at Dooku's neck, which was really cool. I like they mentioned like that Anakin immediately becomes like overwhelmed with guilt after he does it too, but I thought by far the coolest part of that scene was before they switch to Anakin's perspective, Dooku like kind of comes to terms with the fact that he was played by Palpatine. And as the swords are crossed at his neck and he looks over at Palpatine and he sees the body language from Palpatine and hears the things he's saying, they literally like they demonstrate for Dooku mentally how he like comes to terms with the fact that he's a pawn, and it is so like dark.
Right. It's so dark.
It's literally like Dooku's like, all of a sudden Dooku realized that everything that he was, like everything he was as a Jedi, everything he was as a count, all of his
all of his taste, his belongings, his family ties,
everything, all was just like part of a tool for Palpatine to get Anakin.
That's incredible writing. You're right.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like he's literally, and then they don't show this in the movie, but Dooku begs for his life.
He does
from Palpatine at the end, and it's like I was actually listening
right
to
after
this
he
last
talks
night.
trash about people begging for their lives.
Yeah, yeah, dude, that scene was crazy, and it was one of the most kind of poetic parts about it. Is like there's also this moment where Dooku basically comes to terms with the fact where he's like, this is the Sith way, treachery is the Sith way, and he essentially just like kind of like understands like that he just was played the same, and like honestly like he starts to put it together in his head, and he's like, of course this is the guy he wanted the whole time,
right?
And he's like, how did I? And he starts thinking the same things about himself that I was thinking about him. Where I'm like, dude,
this was obvious. Read the rule of two, my guy. Everyone knows.
Dude, what is it with every Sith convincing themselves they're above the rule of two at some point in time? It's insane. Even Bane was like, you know. But anyway, we got to get going here. Yeah. But we're going to continue to work our way. That's just the opening kind of sequence of the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Labyrinth of Evil was good. Highly recommend. We're going to continue to kind of. We'll probably just touch back with the Revenge of the Sith novelization after we get through the Andor stuff, but we might touch base on it depending if we catch something new.
I'm steamrolling through it. Yeah, audiobooks are so fast;
they're so easy. Yeah.
I feel like I'm already like halfway through.
But yeah, we will get to that, and then we have Andor's like 2 weeks away, and the Last of Us season finale or season premiere is literally in 2 days on Sunday. So we will probably have an episode within the next week covering that. As always, we sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting us and supporting the show, and we will see you in a few days.
Thanks a lot.